Imhotep. I think this is Brother Runoko Rashidi on the line. Let's bring him on. Hotep, is this Runoko? Okay, how you doing, brother?
Yes, my brother. Mm-hmm.
You okay?
Yeah, none other. Good evening.
Okay, good. Good evening, brother. Good evening. Okay, good. I know you're out of the country, so we appreciate you calling in, brother. Definitely appreciate that. I know you've been very busy, as usual. So, and I've been reading your articles, man, and blown away by them, brother. So, hey, we want to, thank you for that, and definitely keep up the good work. I've posted them a few times on our Facebook fan page, the African History Network, man. They've gotten tremendous response. I mean, shared, like 300-400 times, a lot of likes and a lot of responses. So, definitely thanks for that, brother. But tonight I wanted to have you to just, talk to us about some of the recent articles you've written for AtlantaBlackStar.com. You have one dealing with invasion, theft, rape, murder, the Aboriginal Holocaust in Tasmania. Another one dealing with the Black Madonnas of Europe. And the last one, I just finished reading that today. I don't want to butcher the brother's name. Help me with the pronunciation. Joseph, is it Bologne?
Joseph, no. Yeah, you did butcher it, brother. It's Joseph Bologne. Joseph Bologne, and Joseph Bologne came to be known in history as the Chevalier de Saint George, or the Saint Georges, and this is an African who was born in Guadeloupe in the Caribbean on the December 25th, 1745, and he became one of the great men in what's called the Golden Age of French history. And you have a number of people like that who just stand out. There weren't many of them, but they were brilliant. People like Alexander Pushkin in Russia, or people like Adolf Baden in Sweden, and Angelo Solomon in Austria, the Dumas family in France. There was a man in Germany named Wilhelm Anton Amo, who graduated with a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Halle, I think, in Germany in 1796. So you have, even during the age of enslavement, you have a handful of Africans and men of African descent. You never find records of African women, but men of African descent who managed to distinguish themselves in a very, I guess what could be called a very hostile environment, at the very least a very lonely environment. And I find it fascinating. Sometimes people ask me, Runoko, why are these things important, or why are these people important? Because any African who's able to excel in whatever endeavor in an area where there are very few Africans, and there's a hostility, a general hostility towards Africans, it makes for a remarkable story. We find people like Septimius Severus, the great African emperor of Rome, or you find people like Saint Maurice, the African patron saint of the Holy Roman Germanic Empire. It's just really remarkable things. So thank you for mentioning Joseph Bologne, and I certainly appreciate it, and I think a lot of sisters and brothers appreciate that.
Absolutely.
If you want to know, or if the audience wants to know, I'm in France right now, and it's 3:35 in the morning. So if I sound subdued, that's the reason why.
Okay, I thought it was PM there, but yeah, it is. They are like about 6 hours ahead of us, or something like that, 6-7 hours ahead. Okay, definitely. Well, we're not gonna hold you long, brother. I know what you said when you emailed me. So we definitely appreciate you coming home, brother. And we do have international listeners. We have listeners in the UK, Japan, things like that. So we definitely appreciate it. But your article here, April 13th, Joseph. Is it Bologne?
Bologne.
Okay. First of all, it's a fascinating article, and I encourage everybody to read it. But it talks about the age of enlightenment in France. Okay, and his life is within that period of time, the 18th century. What is the age of enlightenment in France, if you don't mind sharing that with us?
Well, I would say the Age of Enlightenment is due to the exploitation of Africa and African people. France had begun to establish itself or reaffirm itself as a world colonial power. France is one of the biggest slave trading countries, and they grew wealthy as a result of that. So there's a tremendous amount of wealth, and it leads to what's called a golden age in France. Now, you're looking at it from the perspective of the French, not the perspective of the Africans or the exploited people. But there's a lot of things going on, too, a lot of intellectual ferment. For example, I believe it's 1794 where you have the French Revolution. And the Haitian Revolution is a part of that. You know, so slavery was abolished, you know, in all of the French colonies. And it wasn't, I think, if I have my history correctly, it was reinstituted as a result of the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. So when people talk about folks like Robespierre and Marie Antoinette and Alexander Dumas, all of that comes out of this period in French history. But the basis of it, I don't think there's any doubt, is the exploitation of enslaved Africans. And this will ultimately lead, or actually it's already in the process of doing it, to the exploitation of Africa itself, so that slavery is abolished, or enslavement is abolished, if you prefer that term. And it becomes more an issue, a direct issue of French colonialism in Africa. Of all the colonial powers, the French grabbed the most of Africa, closely followed by the British.
Wow. You know, when I think now, correct me if I'm wrong, does that period of time, does that also have something to do with the French philosophers and them trying to, an age of reason and thought or critical thinking, something like that? Does that have something also to do with that period of time?
Well, the greatest of the French philosophers during that period of time is, and remember, this is all new to me too. I'm learning the whole process. The greatest of the French philosophers is Voltaire, and then you're followed by a whole nother, you know, era from the time that the Chevalier de Saint Georges died. And by the way, the word Chevalier means knight in French, so he became a knight. His father was a French nobleman, and his mother apparently was the most beautiful woman, the most beautiful African woman in the island of Guadeloupe. And so at a young age, Joseph Bologne goes to France, and because of his father's status, he receives a superior education. You know, he was able to excel in many, many things. So on the one hand, his race is not a complete impediment, but he was only able to rise so far. Just to get to your question, but add a bit more information, he's also known as the Black Mozart. And Mozart actually had to come to him and ask him for a job. You know, Joseph Bologne was the head of the French, I think the French opera. And Mozart actually came and asked him for a job. Joseph Bologne was an associate of Marie Antoinette. He set the trends for fashion. And he's just a really remarkable person. So he dies around 1800, 1795, 1794, 1800, and 1795, that period of time. And right after that, you have the Dumas family. You have this family of African descendant people from Haiti. And, of course, Alexander Dumas is the person who wrote The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo and The Man in the Iron Mask. And he is a contemporary of people like Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo is the Charles Dickens of France. Victor Hugo wrote the book which was called Notre Dame, which came to be known to history as The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And he also wrote the book Les Miserables, where he talks about Jean Valjean, the man who was arrested as a young person for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his family and was given like a 20-year prison sentence, something like that, and who eventually got out of prison and who spent most of the rest of his life trying to duck and dodge from his criminal past. And so there's a discussion about class differences as well, between the haves and the have-nots. And he's a contemporary of Emile Zola. And Emile Zola was the person who wrote about a famous trial called the Dreyfus Trial. And so all of these, people were talking about the status, not necessarily of black people per se, but the status of class and the haves and the have-nots. So all of this is a part of this period that Joseph Bologne is said to have lived. And the lesson, I suppose, that comes out of this for me is that all history is interconnected. Just to make a fantastic leap, for example, and something that I'm learning right now and trying to incorporate in my work is the fact that the civil rights movement in the United States, what we call the U.S. Civil Rights Movement beginning in the mid-1950s, and that led to the Black Power movement in the 1960s, cannot be separated from the African liberation movement in Africa. That Martin Luther King was a keen observer of the African liberation struggle. That Dr. King went to Africa several times, and so did Coretta Scott King, for that matter.
Correct.
Dr. King was in Africa at the time of the independence of Ghana. Martin Luther King went to Jamaica and spoke glowingly at the shrine of Marcus Garvey. And so there was a Black Power movement in Australia. There was a Garvey movement in Australia. And so I guess what I'm trying to do is, in a sense, with all of this, is connect the dots and to show that black history is everybody's history, that you can't separate one from the other, and that all of these phenomena are interconnected.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I don't know if you know Professor Manu Ampem out of California, man, but because I've done some interviews with him dealing with the distortion of the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., man. Dr. King's one of the most misunderstood people in history. His legacy has been totally distorted. And a lot of people don't know about him studying African history, him being a keen observer of of Africa's liberation movements, things like this. That's totally not talked about when we talk about Dr. King. Also, very quickly here, in this article, you also talk about Code Noir, Law of Blacks. Talk about that a little bit, because when we hear about the French, we hear about Paris, France, and things like this, but we don't hear about them oppressing African people that much. I guess those who really study African history, we know about the French and the colonies, things like this, but in general, you really don't hear about this, about the French.
Well, no, I suppose not. You hear stories about people like Josephine Baker, or people like Richard Wright and Langston Hughes. All of them came to France and lived in France. One of Richard Wright's daughters, and of course, for those who don't know Richard Wright, we're talking about the author of books like Black Boy and Native Son, classical African-American literature, you might say. So in many ways, I think a lot of African-Americans, at least, have viewed France, and Paris in particular, as a haven against white supremacy. And I suppose for African Americans, that may be true to some extent. I've rarely encountered, overt racism in France. I've been coming here for over 10 years now, and I like it here. It's a good experience. Lots of Africans here, lots of museums, great public transportation. Expensive, but beyond that, it's not a bad place. But for Africans from the continent of Africa itself, or Africans who don't have money, Africans who don't have what are generally known as papers, it's a hell on earth. And let me add, too, that each colonial power employed different techniques for dealing with their colonial subjects. And one of the things that the French did was to incorporate a sense of French identity, however false and frivolous that might be. I meet people even now from countries like not Democratic Republic of Congo, but Congo-Brazzaville or French Congo, or Gabon or Central African Republic, countries that have been, at least on paper, independent for 50 years or more, who go around saying, I'm French. You don't encounter sisters and brothers from Jamaica or Nigeria or Ghana, as poor as some of these countries are, although the material wealth is, should make them very wealthy. You don't hear these sisters and brothers going around saying, I'm English. But the French did a marvelous job when I say marvelous, I'm saying that with some degree of sarcasm. I'm applauding my enemy to an extent. They did a wonderful job in incorporating a sense of French identity. And so people, in many cases, feel like their loyalty is to France. And then the Dutch did their own particular job, and the Germans, and the Belgians, and the Portuguese, and the Spanish. For example, the Portuguese developed a group of people called the Assimilados, who are largely the offspring of the Portuguese and Africans, and put them in charge. And so the French are very similar to that. The French were some of the most effective colonizers, very, very racist, and a lot of us just don't know about that. And that's something that troubles me a great deal. I spend a lot of time on Facebook as well, as you know, and one of the things that strikes me, in fact, I should do, I've got several other articles coming up soon in Atlanta Black Star, but I see their format. And one of the things that they do is they might say 10, great Africans who they need to make a movie about, or the 5 Africans who we need to emulate, or 5 classical civilizations that weren't in Africa but were black, things like that. Well, one of the things, if I ever get the time, I'd like to write is like, what are the greatest myths of Africa? I don't know how I jumped to this point, but one of these myths might be that Africa is not named after a Roman general, or that the reason Africans are scattered around the world is not because of Pangea. Things of that nature. And the other thing is, I guess the point I was going to make, and I want to say this, and then I'll shut up for a moment. I guess I'm sleep deprived. Is oh my God, it's almost 4:00 in the morning.
You were talking about the myths.
I was talking about the myths, but there's one myth in particular that I wanted to introduce. I guess it'll come back to me, brother. Sorry about that.
Okay, yeah, but Pangea is a good one. I can email you some things, man. Africa was named after
Here we go. I got it. Maybe the thing that frustrates me on Facebook the most is when I make a post and people say, I didn't know that. No, they don't say I didn't know that. They typically say, they didn't tell me that. We didn't learn this in school, as if it's the responsibility of other people to teach us our history, that we have become so intellectually lazy, let's be real, and so psychologically dependent that even though many of us say that the European is the enemy of Africa or Africans, that we still expect that enemy to teach us our history. And when you look at that, you realize how slavery, and colonialism has reduced us psychologically as a group of people. So, anyway, I could ramble on and on, about that, but those are some points I wanted to make in attempting to address your question in some way, form, or fashion.
You're right about that. And see, what happens is, especially when you go to the college level, you go through college and then you get your degree, you get your bachelor's degree, you get your master's degree, and you don't learn this information. And you thought that you had a good education. You graduated from Princeton or Notre Dame or Wayne State University. You thought you had a good education, and you didn't learn any of this. And it becomes shocking. Let's not just look at high school level. Let's look at college level. Okay, you pay all this money, and you didn't learn any of this stuff. Okay, that can become very shocking to people. Luckily it was in college where I started really studying African history. Okay, so I got at least some of this information, and I studied on my own. So when I took my first Africana Studies classes, I was talking about things that the professors didn't know about. Kind of shocked the hell out of me. but still, I still learned things from them. But I was dropping stuff on them that they didn't know. So,
I think you can't teach what you don't know, and for the most part, we don't know what we don't know until we begin to know it. I sound a little bit like a philosopher now.
No,
but
you're
it's
correct.
very, very true. And all of this is a part of the African liberation process. I think Garvey said it best in terms of freeing your mind, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. Nobody can free us but ourselves, that Bob Marley later picked up on and incorporated into the lyrics of a song. And so I just think, in a sense, I suppose it's wonderful that in spite of everything that we've gone through, that we're here to have this conversation and talk about these things. And not only, is it the other thing, it can generate a tremendous amount of anger, and even hatred. Once you begin to realize what has happened to us and you didn't know about it. I remember when I was a university freshman or sophomore and I began to read about lynchings, and I was just furious. And if you had asked me what motivated me at that time, I would have said hatred for white people. But fortunately, I went through that phase, and I was able to channel that energy. And that's another message that I think that we need to give our people. If you're just going to be angry, you're not effective. But if you're able to channel that anger, that excitement, that emotion in a positive direction that will uplift your community, then ultimately it turns out to be a good thing. So people like you and the work that you're doing in an unorthodox fashion, putting this information out there, it's invaluable.
Oh, thank you, brother. Thank you, and we appreciate you definitely. We're going to shift gears here into this other article that you wrote, and then we're going to wrap it up early for you also. We're going to wrap it up early, so don't worry about that. Oh, okay. But Professor Kaba Kamene, also known as Booker T. Coleman, I do a show with him every Wednesday night, okay? And he gave me this quote, and also Dr. David Imhotep, who wrote The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. When I had him on about 3 weeks ago, he gave me this quote also. This is from Napoleon Bonaparte, and Napoleon said, quote, "My decision to destroy the authority of the blacks in Saint Dominique or Haiti is not so much based on considerations of commerce and money as on the need to block forever the march of the blacks in the world." Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. I posted it a few times on Facebook myself. I'd like to find the source of it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I agree. I got to ask Brother Copper where he got it from to see, and also Dr. David Imhotep. It's interesting. They both had that, so I have to see where they got that from. But I found that very interesting. Your article, March 19th, on AtlantaBlackStar.com, and everybody, please check out the website. They have tremendous information. I've talked to Brother Andre Moore, I think it is, with Atlanta Black Star. I'm going to be doing some things with them also. But this article here, Invasion, Theft, Rape, Murder, the Aboriginal Holocaust in Tasmania. We don't hear a lot about Tasmania, and we don't hear even less about the Africans in Tasmania. But tell us, briefly about this.
Well, there is a place called Tasmania. It's not just something that you hear in cartoons. Tasmania is an island off the southeast coast of Australia. Australia is the largest inhabited continent in the world, permanently inhabited continent. Antarctica would officially qualify, but Antarctica doesn't have a history of human population. Mostly the people there who are scientists. The people in Antarctica today are scientists, but Tasmania is an island about the size of Ireland or West Virginia, and it's been inhabited for at least the last 35,000 years, I suspect more, by black people, who you can say are the descendants of Africa. Everybody's the descendants of Africa. And that they, these short-statured black people, nappy hair, happy to be nappy hair, settled there, and lived in what seems to be peace and harmony. I think there are two groups of black folk there. I think one is called the Palawa, P-A-L-L-L-W-A. No, I think it's P-A-L-L-A-W-A. And I think the other group is Pakana. I believe that's the name, P-A-K-A-N-A. And they lived in peace and harmony. They had a very, very basic and rudimentary human technology. For example, they've never found any evidence of farming there, as we know it today, or no evidence of fishing, or even the domestication of fire. So these sisters and brothers were isolated there, perhaps 10,000, I don't know how many. And then around 1800, the British came, actually that came in the 17th century. You have a man named a Dutchman named Abel Jansen Tasman. He settled there or landed there, and that's who the island is named after, Abel Jansen Tasman. And after that, it was called Tasmania. And then the French came in the French. They say that with great sarcasm in the 18th century. Right. And then the real catastrophe came when the British came, and this is around 1800, 1801. And the British took the land. Tasmania was established as a British prison settlement or prison colony. And so the worst, the most horrendous of the British criminals were taken to Tasmania, not the mainland Australia itself. And they got loose, and they slaughtered those sisters and brothers. And then, a conscious decision was made just to take the land for the British. The British even denied the humanity of these people. And so most of them, from around 1801 to 1876, were rounded up, killed, and a few remnants were put in what could be called a concentration camp in a place called Oyster Cove, which I visited. And the reason I wanted to write that article in particular, I talked to Andre a few months ago, and he asked me to start writing for the Atlanta Black Star, and I was honored to do it. I think it's a great publication or a great website.
Yes, it is.
A great source is because I wanted to, just as I was mentioning a few minutes ago in my sleep delirium, to help destroy some of the mythology around it, so that people have been going around saying all the Tasmanians were wiped out. And I used to say that until I knew better. And then I went to Australia, and I went to Tasmania, and I met them. And they weren't wiped out. All the full-bloods were killed or eventually died. But in this process, the British captured Aboriginal Tasmanian women. And I know some people object to the word Aboriginal, so I won't use it. I'll say indigenous or black Tasmanians. They captured some of the women and used them as sexual slaves. And children were born from those unions. So that the Aboriginal, there I go again, the indigenous Tasmanians of today are a highly mixed group of people with a lot of problems. Their children were taken away from them, so that you have issues like big issues, domestic violence, substance abuse. You have the stolen generations. These are the generations of indigenous children who were taken away from their parents and raised as slaves or in a slave-like condition. And these things haunt the sisters and brothers in Tasmania today. So it was an article that I was really pleased to write. It's really a rehash of articles I've been writing over the last 20 years. And I'm happy to say that that was the first article of mine that was published by the Atlanta Black Star.
Right. Yeah, it's a fantastic article. I posted it a few times on our Facebook fan page, the African History Network, and it's gotten tremendous response, and people just didn't know really any of this history. In my page, it's exploded in the past 5 months. So I have I think it's 161,000 followers now.
Wow.
All of them are not. What did you say?
No, I was saying, wow, that's very impressive.
Oh, yeah, actually, thank you. All of them are not conscious, so a lot of this information is totally new to them, but it's good that all of them are conscious because we have to get this information beyond just the choir,
True.
so to speak. Lastly, you have a fantastic article for March 26th of this year, AtlantaBlackStar.com once again, the Black Madonnas of Europe, Miracle Workers, and Holy Icons. And I know you deal with some of this information in your fantastic book, Black Star, The African Presence in Early Europe. I tell everybody to get this book. I talk about it in some of my presentations. I tell people, it's a fantastic book. But tell us about this article, because some people still aren't familiar with the Black Madonnas of Europe at all.
Well, sometimes they're called Black Virgins, but still a lot of people just don't know about them. I wanted to write something, March is, I don't know how it came to be, but it's been designated Women's Month, or Women's History Month.
History Month.
And so February is our month, officially, Black History Month. So I wanted to write something that would connect black history with, women's history, something that I hoped would be considered empowering and inspirational. And it's fascinating. So what you have are images throughout Europe, throughout the world for that matter, but most of them are concentrated in Europe, several hundred of them, of statues or paintings or icons of the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus, but they're painted black. And because they're black, it is believed that they're able to perform miracles. And you could say that they are the superstars of the cult of Mary. And I've been able to see personally about 8 or 9 of them. And it's one of the most remarkable phenomenon I've ever experienced. Seeing these black statues with, for the most part, European features is interesting. But seeing how the local people act around them, the fervor and the degree of adoration, it's really, really, really remarkable. I don't know if there's anything like it comparable in the world. I've seen them in Russia. That was my first experience in Europe seeing them. France has the most, particularly in southern France, along the routes that the Crusades were preached and the routes that the Crusaders marched to get to Palestine and to, embark upon the voyage to Jerusalem. Italy has quite a few. Spain has some really remarkable ones, including one called La Marinetta. That was, we used a photograph in there. So it's really a remarkable thing. Now, people can say they don't believe in that if they want to. That's fine with me. But when you go into these churches, what you find are the prayers of people written to the Madonna, and the prayers are for expressed in gratitude of miracles that are attributed to the Black Madonna. People who were crippled were able to walk, and they left their crutches or their braces in the church. People who were blind and claimed that they could see, or women who had been unable to conceive and all at once got pregnant. One of the more recent ones that I've seen is in a place called Halle in Belgium, which is right outside Brussels. And this Black Madonna, one of the most interesting ones, who is actually depicted breastfeeding the infant Jesus, painted black as a lump of coal, is supposed to, her major miracle is that she stopped an invasion of that part of Belgium. And supposedly she caught 33 cannonballs fired by the enemy, the invading army, in the lap of her skirt. Now, you could dismiss that all you want to, but when you go to the church, they have the cannonballs arrayed around the statue of the Black Madonna. So it's really, really an interesting phenomenon. So all of these articles are written to inform, to inspire, with the belief that very few things are as important in our studies as history. As Malcolm said, of all our studies, it is history that is most qualified to reward our research. So I look forward to writing a number of these articles for the Atlanta Black Star. I've already submitted articles on the Black Kingdoms of ancient Southeast Asia. I'm looking forward to that. Vietnam, Cambodia. That ought to be a good one. Great photographs. And I wrote another one on Jay Rogers and another one on Ivan Van Sertima, and there are one or two others. I'd like to do something on the black presence in India, stating that of all the countries in the world, India has the largest black population. And I'd like to do a piece on the missing noses on the African statues, because that's another thing that I get all the time. Guaranteed, a sure bet, if I post something right now, after I get off the phone with you, a statue from ancient Egypt, and the nose is missing, somebody, within a matter of moments, is going to say, they knocked the noses off. Or if you show a picture of Hormaka the Great Sphinx, people will say Napoleon did that. And then I said, well, how do you know that? And when you say they knocked the noses off, who are they? When did this happen? Why did they do it? What happened to those noses? I don't know. Somebody told me. I heard it on YouTube. Somebody said, I always believed it was my teaching. And then I get back, and this irritates people. But what is the evidence? What is the proof? What is the documentation? And then they get mad at me. They want to stone the messenger. So, my brother, to me, it's interesting not only what people think, but how you arrive at these conclusions. Because in many ways, even the so-called African conscious community is no different from any other people. Many people, in many cases, we're like the Tea Party or the birthers who say, I don't care what you say, I don't care what you tell me, Barack Obama is not a U.S. citizen. He was, and in many of us, we're the same way. How do you get this information? I don't know. I just believe it. Somebody told me, and that's amazing to me. People consider themselves sophisticated and intellectually astute, but they just repeat the things we've always heard, even though there's no evidence to support it.
I get the same thing, brother. I get the same thing, man. And I'm like, and see, I try to deal with facts and evidence as much as possible, and I had this conversation with somebody 2 weeks ago who said that Africa was named after Scipio Africanus. And I broke down historically and linguistically how that is impossible and gave sources. And they didn't want to believe me because here's what they said. No disrespect to the elder, but they said that this is what Dr. Ben said. And I said, no disrespect to Dr. Ben, but he did the best he could do with the limited resources he had. But where is the evidence? We can look at the language, because we look at Africanus. Africanus means of Africa or belonging to Africa. I went and bought a Latin English dictionary when I was doing my research on this to find that out. And then we look at the word Africa. I had Professor James Small on a couple weeks ago. He broke down the word Africa means land of the Afri. And the Afri are, North African people in Algeria and Tunisia, black North African people who are still there today. And then we can look at that Publius Cornelius Scipio, his family's last name was not Africanus. That was not his surname. He took that after he conquered that territory because it was already named that. But we can look at numerous sources, but people don't want to. They don't want to do that. They just want to believe myths and fairy tales, man. So.
And I can't figure that out. Now is that the result of slavery, and it just made us, as I pointed out earlier, psychologically dependent and intellectually lazy? Do we need a white person to tell us these things in order for a lot of us to believe it? The people, as you know, become argumentative and very, very defensive about these things. And it's really, in many ways, it's an insult, or the name Al-Kabulan. People say that was the original name for the continent of Africa. And I've come to the conclusion that's very Eurocentric thinking. The idea of continents doesn't seem to come out of the African experience. What makes you think that people had a name for an entire continent, or that people in ancient times even realized that they lived on a continent? Where do these designations come from? And so if you can't even ask the right question, you will never be able to get an acceptable answer, because whether we realize it or not, for the most part, we're looking at things from a Eurocentric perspective. And as a result of that, a lot of the things we study simply don't make sense, because we're not looking at it from an African perspective. You have probably done some work, and this is something I should do more work on myself, is in the orientation of the world. That if we go, for example, to Kemet in ancient times, the references to Upper Kemet, Lower Kemet, Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, but up is the south. Lower is the north. And so in a sense, and Charles Finch told me this way back in the early 1980s, the great Charles Finch, is that we're looking at the world upside down, without realizing it. And we get a little bit of knowledge, and we become very arrogant with it in many cases, and you don't want to hear anything else. It's as though you believe you've arrived, and therefore there's no need to go any further. And I think that we do ourselves an injustice. For those of us, who have suffered and struggled and scrapped for hundreds of years, our ancestors taken out of the door of no return, etc., I think they deserve the truth. One of the scholars that I most admired and still do, who had a big influence on me, was Dr. Chancellor James Williams in his magnificent book, Destruction of Black Civilization, where he says essentially the African historian must be on a relentless search for truth. It must not tremble with fear when that truth is contrary to what one would prefer to believe. And that's a difficult threshold for a lot of us to cross.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, very briefly here, in Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, Anthony Browder dispels a lot of myths, and he shows the correct orientation of Africa, because the way that it's depicted to us is actually upside down, and Africa is actually much larger in comparison to Europe and other continents than is actually depicted. Okay, so these are things that we really have to understand and uncover. And as you say, and I paraphrase you in my presentations, and I borrow this from you. I always give you credit for it. I show a picture of you, introduce a lot of people to you, and I've made it my own. But I say what you do for yourself, what you do to yourself, and what you allow other people to do to you is based upon what you think about yourself. What you think about yourself is based upon what you've been taught about yourself. What you've been taught about yourself is based upon everything you've read, heard, and seen about yourself. Okay, so
I fully agree with that. Obviously. Yes. But that's not from me. I heard, I was in Ghana several years ago, and there was a brilliant brother from Cleveland, or in Cleveland, named Qua David Whitaker. Has a law degree and a PhD. Brilliant brother. And he has a way of speaking. And he was addressing a group of people, particularly young people, and he used that expression: what you do for yourself depends on what you think of yourself, and what you think of yourself depends on what you know of yourself, and what you know of yourself depends on what you have been told. That's really my philosophy of history. But I think, if I recall properly, that those words actually go back to John Henry Clark. And I'm sure that they were not original with Dr. Clark. That what we're doing, I think I can say, it's not really new. It may take on new dimensions and new directions sometimes. But what we're doing, you mentioned Manu and Michael Imhotep and Tony Browder and Brother Kaba and James Small and so many others, we're just continuing what our ancestors have been doing for a very, very long time, and that is trying to put Africa in a positive light, and African history in a positive light, and use that information as a motivating force, as a kind of a guideline for what we need to do. Because history, as you know, cannot just be dates and facts and figures and what happened in a certain year. It has to have meaning. It has to have substance. It has to be a roadmap. And I think, it's a very positive thing that we're doing, and I would like to think the ancestors are pleased by our efforts.
Absolutely. Well, I hope they are, brother, and I know what it's like to do research, man. Because I just did a lecture January 24th that was the culmination of about 4 years of research, and it was 100 slides, and it was about 4.5-hour presentation, and I still didn't get all the information in. It was on the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school, understanding that. So I have an inkling understanding of it, and I wanted to make sure that I represented the ancestors. I wanted to make sure I put together something that honored the ancestors. That was like one of my biggest concerns, in putting that together. So, hey, I understand that. Well, look, brother, when I originally emailed you and you said it was 3:30 there, I was thinking 3:30 p.m. I didn't realize it was 3:30 a.m.
No, I don't know what I was thinking when I accepted this opportunity to be on your show. No. No, it's an honor. You can't turn down an opportunity to talk about African history, and you can't turn down an opportunity to promote the work. And one of the things I'm doing, I spend a lot of time in Europe. My daughter lives right outside of Paris. I think a lot of people know that. My mother has Senegalese roots. One of the interesting things about Europe is that you have the descendants of all the Africans that the Europeans colonized. So that next week, for example, my next lecture is in Berlin. I'm going to address 3 African German organizations. I'm very excited about that. This is the 130th anniversary of the beginning of the infamous Berlin Conference, where the Europeans, like a mafia family, like the Godfathers, just said, we're going to divide Africa up. No point in us fighting each other. There's enough for everybody. The Germans, the French, the Belgians, the Spanish, even the Italians. And so I like it here, and I learned so much here. The museums are here. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is to promote my tours to Europe and promote my tours in general. So I spend a lot of time here, and I guess I just have to get used to the time difference. I do want to encourage people, if they want information about these tours, the next one is to Morocco and Spain in June, and then the African presence in Mexico, the Olmec heads in July. And then in August, I take a group to see some of the great African collections in European museums. If Europeans do anything well, it's steal, or they would say acquire. So we're taking a group to Berlin, to Amsterdam, to Paris, and to Brussels. That's in August. And then to cap off the year, we'll take a group to Nigeria and Cameroon. And then we start up next year. In May, we already have a trip planned for Ethiopia, including southern Ethiopia, in the Omo Valley and Kenya. And so if people are interested in that, and I'll be in Detroit, I believe, on the 1st of August. Minister Shabazz is bringing me back, so I'll get a chance to see you there. But I encourage people to email me, call me. I do check my phone messages even when I'm not in the United States, and to go to my website. If you want to email me, please go to Runoko@yahoo.com or Runoko@hotmail.com. Runoko@hotmail.com, Runoko@yahoo.com, and Runoko is RUNOKO. Or you can go to my website, which I'm using now, www.travelwithrunoko.com. Or you can even call me at area code 323-920-6055. That's 323-920-6055. So don't feel bad because it's almost 4:30 in the morning. I was the one who accepted the invitation. I'm grateful to Andre Moore and Atlanta Black Star. But you're doing a great job, brother, and you're getting a very positive reputation. And you know what the ancestors used to say, a good name is better than gold. And you have a very good name, and you should be proud of that. I'm proud of it.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, brother. Well, look, brother, you know, you get some sleep, and people check out. Also on Facebook, tell people how they can follow you on Facebook, because you have the Facebook group where you do the class on Friday nights also, right? You're still doing that, right?
In fact, you're in that class. I don't know if you know it or not, but you got a scholarship. And I'm going to start the class again in during the summer. I don't know if it'll be June or what. I'm looking for the best time. And there'll be an 8-week course on the African presence in Asia and the African presence in Europe, 4 weeks on each. And you did mention my book, African Star Over. I don't know if you mentioned that book, but you mentioned Black Star, the African presence in early Europe. The other book, the companion book, is African Star Over Asia, the Black presence in the East. And so, again, you can go to www.travelwithrunoko.com and see how you can order that book. But, yeah, the class is on Friday night. I'm winding down this course. I'm big on Facebook, even though Facebook itself seems to be going through transition. And I don't know what the next big social media is going to be. But you can. I have about 5 pages. One is the Global African Presence, which is a fan page. And then it's I have a couple pages, Runoko Rashidi, one called Travel with Runoko, another one called Around the World with Runoko. I'm really trying to push that, these global travels, this global Africa.
Okay, we just lost Runoko. Maybe he'll call back in. He is in Paris, France right now, so I don't know if it's a problem with his phone or something like that. But we're wrapping up. We're winding down the interview, and I didn't realize it was 3:30 in the morning there. I don't know what I was thinking. I just didn't realize it was 3:30 in the morning. When he said something about 3:30, I thought he said p.m. in the email. So because of the time that it was, and I didn't want to hold the brother for the whole hour. That's why we didn't take. We had, I think, maybe a couple callers, but that's why I didn't take callers. I didn't want to I didn't want to do that to him because it's so early in the morning, and he's so gracious enough to share his time with us. But check out these articles, AtlantaBlackStar.com. You know, we talk about on this show, a lot of the articles come from African-American websites, African-American-owned websites. AfricanGlobe.net is another excellent website. We talk about News1.com. TheRoot.com is I don't think it's on. TheRoot.com is like I think it's owned by the Washington Post. The editor-in-chief is Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. They do have it's geared towards African Americans. They do have some good articles, but it's more political. It's more democratic, politically oriented. We love Obama, civil rights, social justice, things like this. They do have some good things. They do have some good articles on history. I read a lot of Dr. Henry Louis Gates' articles. This is how I know what he talks about. They have some good articles on art history, African-American history, things like this. They don't deal with a lot of ancient African history, but they do have some good articles there. TheGriot.com is another good source. Now, TheGriot.com is, if I remember correctly, is owned by NBC or MSNBC, one of them. But Atlanta Black Star is owned by African Americans, as well as YourBlackWorld.com or YourBlackWorld.net. It's owned by African Americans as well. But Atlanta Black Star, check it out, AtlantaBlackStar.com. They have a lot of good hard-hitting articles. Article they just posted yesterday, 5 traits of great black leaders that you should emulate. And Runoko has his 3 articles there. On our Facebook fan page, the African History Network, we have some articles that I posted from there. What was another one? This one right here. 20 black TV shows you watched if you are a 70s or 80s baby. And, of course, they have a different world, different strokes, things like that. They mentioned Martin, but I talked about how Martin was a very ignorant show. Some people didn't like that, but it was a caricature. And then you have Martin Lawrence dressing up like a woman. Shanae, very stereotypical. Tommy didn't have a job. Cole lived at home with his parents. The mature people were the women. The smartest woman was the light-skinned one. Just total caricatures and a bunch of nonsense. But if you just look at it as entertainment, well, yeah, you're going to be entertained. But the problem is that those images are exported around the world. They don't just stay in D.C. or Chicago or Detroit. No, they get exported around the world. And how does this influence our youth when they see this type of nonsense? Bruh Man from the Fifth Floor. All types of nonsense like this. That's not funny. All right, maybe you have low standards, but that's somebody who's a critical thinker